Good evening and welcome to the American Family Association Presents. Tonight's topic is New York State's fiscal crisis, causes and conflicts, and this is the second part in a two-part series we're presenting tonight. New York is facing the most serious fiscal issues it's had to face in decades. On top of this is a growing property tax problem in our suburbs and educational quality problems in our city schools. What can be done without forcing more New Yorkers to flee the state? Our guests tonight are Larry Levy and Frank Russo. Larry Levy has spent 30 years as a reporter and columnist for Long Island Newsday, covering politics, education, and tax issues. Larry is also a member, Larry is the executive director of National Suburban Studies at Hofstra University here in Long Island. Frank Russo is a former division manager with AT&T Verizon and serves on the executive committee of the Nassau Conservative Party, as well as Long Islanders for Educational Reform, and is also the president of the AFA of New York. Frank is married with 7 children and 27 grandchildren. My co-host tonight is Connell Friel. Welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Frank, previous show we were just talking about the financial crisis facing the country and New York State in particular. I'd like to ask you what some concrete examples are that Albany can do and to alleviate the financial crisis. And I want you to concentrate on school boards and local governments in particular.
Okay, so this is not Albany, this would be local school boards.
Local school boards and
there are certain
what Albany can do.
Well, Albany deals with, like we talked about in the other show, pensions and things. But the local school boards have a lot to say that oftentimes they try to minimize. They try to say everything's mandated. 80% of our budget's mandated, which is absolute nonsense. The one big area that the school boards control entirely in their negotiations with the teacher union and other employee unions is health insurance. Pensions are controlled by the state law. Health insurance is controlled by the local school board. In Port Washington, we recently got our school teachers to pay 20%, from 12% up to 20%. We've got to get it up to 50-50 split eventually. School districts are gradually moving in that direction. We spend an average for a typical teacher with family $15,000. Single teacher might be $8,000 or $9,000. But the school district pays the bulk of it. The taxpayers are paying the bulk of it, which means they pick very luxurious and expensive plans more often. We've got to get to a point where it's 50-50, just like private corporations are doing, and that'll make them pick more prudent plans. Health insurance costs typically are about 12% of the school district budget. It's an enormous part. It's a very, very expensive part. Second area would be the pay levels. And I know Larry and I are going to probably disagree on this. Port Washington in February, as part of 2009, Port Washington median teacher salary, not counting extra pay for teachers working photography club or whatever after school. Base pay for a median teacher, the middle teacher, half make more, half make less. People are going to be stunned at this. $97,000.
Really?
With the extra pay, $100,000. Benefits are $30,000, pension and health benefits and so forth. Now, an argument I've heard from teachers, we've had many teachers on our show, my mother, my wife were public school teachers, a daughter, 2 daughters-in-law teachers, just for the record.
I'd like to be at Thanksgiving.
With 27 grandkids. But
Frank is well insured.
what I'm saying, here's the key fact that when teachers come back and say, well, don't you want quality teachers, Frank? Of course we want quality teachers, but pay has nothing to do with it because the worst teacher gets as much as the best teacher. There is no merit pay in any school district on Long Island. And here's the key fact. And it's been like this for 38 years. I've checked it 6 times, roughly every 6-7 years. In a typical school district, every year you have between 100 and 200 applicants for every open position. It's never changed. I checked this in Baldwin in the late 60s. I've checked it in Port Washington just 3 years ago, and prior to that, around every 6 or 7 years. We had 4,800 applicants for 26, 27 openings. Math, physics, calculus, maybe you got to pay extra if it's hard to find a teacher like that. But 98% of the teachers, even if 2/3 are not well qualified, 1/3 are, which means you still got 50 applicants dying to get each open position. Salary levels are way, way too high. We need merit pay. Our school district is finally considering it. We're going to merit pay, where you pay the better teachers more than the poorer teachers. That will also encourage poor teachers to leave. Another key thing, we've got crazy things such as, and I think this is pretty much every school district in the state, you can retire at age 55 as a school employee in Port Washington and pretty much just about every school district. At age 55, after working just 5 years, and get health benefits for life. When I first heard this, I asked my superintendent, could this be true, Dr. Gordon? He says, oh, I don't think so, Frank, but let me check it. Saw me a week or 2 later, saw me at a school board meeting, came up Frank, I can't believe it, it is true. They can retire at age 55, working 5 years, they get health benefits paid for life. Class size is another issue. For typical grades, kindergarten, first, second, I have no problem with 20 kids in a class, but for 5th grade through 12th grade, not ESL, English as a second language, not special needs, just the regular classes, we have in Port Washington 375 classes last year with 19 or fewer students. If we could get that up to 24 to 26 students per class, which is not unreasonable. When I went to Catholic grade school, I had, no, I never went below 65.
Yeah, but look how you turned out.
Exactly. That's a positive motivation. We need to get the class sizes to reasonable levels. We could save $2-3 million in a typical school district if we did that.
Let me piggyback. Let's
Well,
ask me
same
a different
question.
Okay.
Concentrate
Let me
on local
piggyback on
government and school districts.
Once again, Frank framed the broad strokes. There are a couple you could probably add, but if you accept the argument that bigger classes are an answer, and I think that there's a good argument to be made for that. I mean, if you're talking about gently raising it from 19 to 24, the reality is you can't do that in most school districts.
Why?
Forget unions, forget parents screaming, forget teachers, not wanting to have to, deal with 6 more kids. The districts are too small. The problem is you've got too many small districts. If you had bigger districts, you could spread things out in a way that would give you the flexibility to have bigger classes, to have teachers, an art teacher who could have more classes to deal with. You have such an inefficient construct that you need to make sweeping and fundamental changes in the way our school system is structured, because if you don't, it makes it really, really hard to do the in theory, what Frank is talking about. I mean, it's funny, you talk about Frank and I, we kid around about Frank and I disagreeing, but basically he's talking about, in 90%, Newsday's motherhood education reform issues for the last 20 years. I wrote all those before I left. Slightly larger class sizes, teachers paying more for their health insurance. The quote-unquote dirty little secret is that when a school district brags, well, we got our teachers union to agree to cost of living for the next 5 years, there's not a single teacher who's going to get only a 2.5% or 3% pay raise. They're all going to get, except the people at the very, very top, 5 or 6%, because there's something called steps. And even if a district enters into, digs their heels in, and there's no contract, they still get the step. They may not get the cost of living raise, but they'll get the step, and everybody's happy. They're getting a raise anyways that is equal to what, okay. Where I disagree with Frank, I hear the number for the average teacher, the median teacher, and I say, you know what? Even though I know the argument about 200 to 1, it's more complicated than he's saying without getting into an argument with him about who applies and what that number really means. But I like the idea that we can pay somebody who wants to go into education, a youngster, who will start, by the way, at 40,000.
No, 58 in
Well,
Port Washington.
Port Washington is a wealthy school
And
district
all of them are
that
about
can
50,
do it. But,
55
but,
now.
But it takes a long time to get up to $97,000, and it takes having double master's degrees, in some cases PhDs. But the reality is, I don't mind in a community where the median income for everybody is about $70-something thousand of paying a teacher who is charged with taking care of our children that much money. My problem, though, is that we're paying, and this gets to what Frank is talking about, too many teachers who get a benefit structure that was in place when teachers were grossly underpaid. And what they did was, well, at least you got good benefits. Now teachers are making above the median incomes, and they're getting benefits way above the median incomes, like nothing you've ever seen. So fine, if teachers want to make $97,000 a year. At that level, if you want to get a raise, then it should be merit. When you're up at that level, it should be merit.
We're in agreement here.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we really spent a lot of time, we tore apart, the numbers and stuff, we would probably have a lot of disagreement in the details of it.
Right.
But in the broad structure, I want to pay teachers a lot of money, but I can't pay that many. You have a choice here.
So to that end, then, and I want to hear from both of you, and I'm going to pose it to you first, Larry, then, which is, there's been a proposal made by Tom Suozzi led this commission, where he reported into Governor Patterson. It was
Pander Commission.
a property
Patterson, I'm
tax,
sorry, I said pander, didn't I? I meant the Patterson Commission.
property tax,
Freudian slip.
property tax cap relief.
Right.
And he has a proposal that would say, basically, the proposal would put a 4% cap on school
Right.
budgets. What are your thoughts there? And in particular, the circuit breaker.
I don't like caps. I just never like caps. I don't like caps in almost any area. I don't like, judicial sentences where you completely take discretion away from judges.
So why don't you like the caps?
Well, in the case of school districts, in particular, it's one of the few places where, and I know school district elections are not always the democratic process or expressing the will of all the people, but voters can have a chance to say yes or no. There's no other budget anywhere where a voter can say, I do not want that tax rate. I do not want that spending rate. And they can do that. Now, obviously, if they vote it down, it's not going to change very much because of all kinds of state laws. But in theory, this is the most democratic budgeting system that you can possibly have. It's like the town meetings we used to see up in Vermont and New Hampshire. So I don't like it. I would rather give a community the option to be able to tax itself the way it wants and spend the way it wants, as long as you're doing a lot of other things. I like the circuit breaker much better. I don't know if you had shows about the circuit breaker.
We haven't, and I'd like you to talk about a little bit about
Right.
the circuit breaker, and I'll ask the same of
Right.
Frank, because there's many opinions of what the circuit breaker could be. Again, it's with the intention of assisting, but is it possible that it has the type of impact that could be negative for some segments of our society? And the example,
Well, it's not negative because it doesn't make you do anything more. If you are at a certain income level and your house is at a certain value, and the level of your property taxes are out of whack with what is agreed you should be paying for your income level, you will not pay as much. That's what it is. It's like, it says, we recognize that the value of people's property is not always a measure of their wealth. Somebody who bought a house for $20,000 40 years ago, that now may be worth $800,000 or $600,000 on paper, yet they're a retiree or they're working in a retail job, they shouldn't be paying the level of taxes that somebody who's making $500,000 a year living in an $800,000 house.
I think that's a fair point. Frank, I'll direct the
All right,
question to you, and I have some issues with it. I'll raise it in a
I
minute.
basically support the idea of a tax cap. I'm upset that it's set at 4%. I think it should have been much lower, 2.5%. 4% is way too high. It can be overridden by a 55% vote. But I'd like that because it puts some pressure on the school districts to control their spending, which is totally out of control. Typically only 12 to 18% of the voters turn out for a school budget vote. People are too busy. Like I said, I don't want to say, I don't want to criticize the ordinary, but we're partly to blame. The ordinary people who fail to vote, who fail to follow what their legislators' positions are, we share the blame along with Albany and with the school boards for all our tax problems, and they're going to get worse and worse.
But people vote when they're upset, Frank. People
but
vote-
not
when,
enough
when
of
the
them don't.
budgets, when people are really
And
feeling
here's another
pain,
problem.
then you get your 40%
Even when
turnout.
even
they all get
the
voted
choice
down.
when you go to vote, unfortunately, the way it's structured, they'll put up a 5.5%, 6% budget, 5% budget increase, tax increase. If you defeat it, you're still going to get a 4% increase based on the law, the contingency budget. It's a stupid law designed by the big spenders in Albany. So the voters say, why the hell should I go and vote when it's only going to make a tiny difference between a 5% increase or a 4% increase? That's what's happening, and it's a disgrace.
Well, you wouldn't want a law that said if somebody signs a contract and because the voters voted down, that contract's abrogated. The problem is the school boards sign lousy contracts.
They do.
You can't.
They'd have to fire the teachers, increase class size, change the health insurance, and so forth. What I'm saying is a cap, I'd like the lower cap, but a 4% cap is a baby step in the right direction. Circuit breaker, I can't believe this. I mean, I'm retired some number of years, 14 years. My income is not great, but I'm not poverty-stricken. I'm not low income. And yet, what you do lose under the circuit breaker legislation as was proposed, everyone loses their star. They replace, the star is funded with the circuit breaker.
Rich people and poor people get the same star. It makes no sense.
Well, let me finish. I get something like $760 star. Under the circuit breaker legislation, as I viewed it with my numbers and my property taxes, I would get twice as much. I get $1,500 back. So, and I don't say, why should I benefit from this? This is crazy. What the circuit breaker does It's these Long Island Progressive Coalition people and that type that pushes that stuff. They're out of whack. They're
God
not
bless
looking
them.
at the spending. They're not looking at controlling spending. They're looking at who's going to pay. You know, get the guy over there. Get the money from somebody else. Don't try to get the
You're
money
making
from
a
me.
different point.
That's what
you're making a
the
different
circuit
point.
breaker has nothing to do with controlling spending.
Right, exactly.
All
If you
yeah.
just do, he's right. Well, he's right. Wait,
Yeah, that's right.
He's right.
So let me finish my
If
point.
you just do the circuit breaker without doing something about spending, you're
That's
only
the
tackling
point.
half the problem.
But that's all
that
the
doesn't
liberals
mean
want.
that. But,
That's all the
well,
Progressive
but that's not
Coalition wants.
necessarily
They're
true.
against the tax cap.
They
They
want-
want to put no limits on spending. Now, let me tell you one other
That's
thing
not
to finish
true.
my point.
That's a cartoon.
The big
That's
object,
not
the
true.
only objection to passing, that the Republicans did pass the tax cap, one of the little itsy-bitsy things that darn Republicans did that was good, the cowards, afraid of the unions, just like the Democrats. The objection that Shelley Silver and the Democrats in the Assembly had to the tax cap was the following. They're saying, what happens if you have a school district that needs more than 4%? There is legislation that's been proposed 12 years in a row, co-sponsored by 20-some-odd Republicans in the Senate, co-sponsored by 20-some-odd Democrats in the Assembly. It's called the Education Tax Incentive Act. It's been proposed 12 years in a row to provide a tax credit, a generous tax credit of 67% if you contribute to a public school or a public school district, a 50% tax credit if you contribute to a private school scholarship fund, funding scholarships in 2 or more schools, or if a corporation wants to contribute, they get 50% tax credit. The state tax department has looked at it. It's a cost-efficient way to raise roughly $3 at a cost of $2. You claim a federal tax deduction as well, so in effect you're getting federal subsidies for education. In essence, once they get this in, something like $700 million will be donated. Once they up the limits, they have low limits, $120, $1,800 for corporations. Once they get this bill passed and you up it to a $1,000 donation, I'd contribute $1,000 happily. Corporations up to maybe $10,000 or $20,000. You'll see several billion dollars donated. Now, what about the poor districts? There's a clause in the bill that says if you get more than a certain percentage, maybe 1 or 1.5% contributed to your school budget, then 1/3 of the excess above that goes to the commissioner for distribution to low-income districts. So everybody wins with this. Why hasn't it took me 6 years and I couldn't figure out why the heck has this bill not come to a vote? It'll pass overwhelmingly. One reason, I got it from 4 different independent sources. The teacher unions, the public school teacher unions oppose it. I said, why the hell would they oppose it? Public schools are getting more money. The reason they oppose it is they want the private schools to close to give them more union jobs. The greedy teacher unions, public school teacher unions, want this bill to fail, won't let it come up because they want the private schools to close so they get more union jobs.
I want to just take a pause for a minute because I want to kind of redirect the question and reframe it because I'll tell you where I sit. I've been very critical of the proposal, and it's because my fear, and maybe you can help me alleviate it for me, Larry, and it was me that called
Which
in on a
proposal?
recent...
The
It's
cap
the
or the
property
circuit
tax
breaker?
cap. It's
Okay.
the combination of both.
Right.
One, my greatest fear about a 4% cap, I share your concern. I don't think you should ever put a cap on it. I like the idea of local control. But we're coming out of a period, the 90s were mostly low inflation, and the reason why this proposal was successful in Massachusetts was because it was capped at 2.5% and below the rate of
Oh, you're
inflation.
worried about how it affects things in good town.
Wait a minute.
You've changed the floor.
No,
Gotta
well,
say.
I'm concerned now that in the new paradigm, this new economy we're in, where there's significant weakness, we could be looking at a period of no inflation and maybe even deflation, and thus 4% represents an exorbitant amount of increase. Now, my concern about the circuit breaker is that it's all well and good, but again, you have to look at the demographics here in Long Island as a perfect example, where we have as much as, say, 45 to 50% of the population at or approaching an age where they'll be retired, qualifying for those types of tax circuit breakers, and then the state
Right.
raising the income tax to pay
Okay,
for it.
those are very good points. The reason that it doesn't worry me, particularly, and in fact, I'm actually encouraged by what you talk about in terms of the demographic change, time bomb coming up, is that the circuit breaker is funded by New York State.
Income tax, that's what I see coming
No,
right out of
but
it.
here's my point. Long Islanders send, and I don't have a terrible problem with this because it's a progressive tax and we are wealthier than most regions, but Long Islanders send $3 billion more to Albany than they get back. If the circuit breaker, if because of the aging of the population, the circuit breaker starts putting more money into Long Island, then I don't have a problem with that. Will it put enough to make up for the loss of Star, as Frank talks about? I don't know. I haven't done the math. I know a lot of people who talk about how, well, we have 17 or 20% of the students, we only get 13, 14% of the aid. Forget to figure in Star. We get such a disproportionate share of the several billion dollars that goes into Star that it begins to close that gap in terms of Long Island as a region getting its fair share. That's just a little point I thought I'd make.
No, that's a very fair point. Frank, what are your
No,
thoughts
I-
there? No?
I'll get you
Colin,
on to
turn it
more
over
All
to you.
topics.
let's shift gears a little bit. Larry, the New York State is now controlled completely by Democrats, likely to pass some type of same-sex marriage legislation.
Maybe.
Maybe, possibly. What do you think about that?
You know, I think that the activists, you know, the gay and lesbian activists, would be smarter from a political standpoint to push hard for strong civil unions because there, first of all, is a political consensus for it. Let's talk about politics rather than getting into moral questions. If you want to get into that too, and I think that they're going to. They risk starting a political war over something that is not going to get them a lot more than what they had. That's my political analysis of it. That I thought it was a mistake 4 years ago that cost basically the Democrats the presidency because the votes on same-sex marriage sparked backlashes in key states that arguably, and I've seen analysis that says this isn't true, but certainly didn't help the Democrats then. It was a distraction from other issues, the war, the economy, the Bush competency. Personally, I'm just live and let live. I think the institution of marriage is very strong in this country. I think that people who want to be married can stay married. Marriage is not threatened by somebody else taking the word and wanting to live together for the same sex. I just don't understand the level of anger. If the law said my synagogue had to marry a gay couple, I would be outraged and I would be on the streets with you. If they said your church had to marry people of the same sex, I would be with you in front of your church marching, because that is an intrusion of your rights under the Constitution and under God, in my feeling. But in the public square, as long as nobody's violating a law and it's not causing any harm in any other way, I'm not sure I see why this is something that has caused so much anger and been a distraction from everybody's agendas. I think that there are bigger fish that both the right and the left need to fry, that one shouldn't be pushing it and the other shouldn't be going nuts. I mean that as a pejorative, that the left shouldn't go nuts pushing it and the right shouldn't go nuts fighting it. I think it's such a distraction. I think I'd rather put my effort into fighting abortion than fighting gay marriage. I mean, that's about life. That's whether I may disagree about how it should be done, that's a question of morality. It's a question of if you believe that abortion is murder or taking of a human life, you have an obligation to make the fight. But gay marriage, I don't
Frank,
see it.
same question. There
Right.
are fundamental questions for our
And
society.
this is an area I have studied unbelievable amounts because it turned out he was my best friend for 20 years, was a closet homosexual, godfather of my first